Good morning, friends. How are you feeling? All good? Okay. So today I'm going to speak about one of my favorite subjects, which is to talk about the revolutionaries, the other story of how India won its freedom. But let me start first by thanking Shri Aurobindo Society, Professor Babu, Dr. Chauhan, and all of you for making time this morning for allowing me to make this presentation. So the presentation is really about one specific period of India's freedom struggle. And the reason this is an interesting story is because much of the earlier 20th century's history of the freedom struggle is dominated by the non-violent movement. But as I will hope to prove to you, there was also an armed struggle, which was just as important a part of the story. And it has a longer history. So in fact, armed resistance to British occupation of India goes back right to the beginning in the 1770s with the rebellion in Bengal, now known as the Sannyasi rebellion, on which Anandamath was written and Vande Mataram came from it. So this is really a story which is much, much longer. And there were rebellions everywhere. There were rebellions in Odisha, the Paikar revolutions, the rebellion in South India, the polygars rose in rebellion here, and so on and so forth. So there was a whole bunch of rebellions that were continuously happening. And it culminated, of course, in the Great Rebellion of 1857-58. Now, with the crushing of that rebellion, the traditional India, sort of the pre-modern India, India's resistance, so to speak, to British occupation largely ended as a threat. Now, there were places where it continued. For example, you had the tribal rebellions in what is now Jharkhand. There were rebellions in Manipur, for example. But they were not serious threats to overall domination of British in India. So what I'm going to talk about is a new cycle of rebellion that started essentially at the turn of the last century. And it was inspired by many things. It is inspired, of course, by memories of the previous revolutions and resistance, not just, by the way, to the British, but previous eras of foreign occupation, for example, by the Mughals and so on. And also from new ideas that were coming from nationalist writers in Europe. This is much forgotten today, but Mazzini and Garibaldi, the Italian nationalists, were a great inspiration. Another great source of inspiration was the rise of Japan as a power, especially after 1905 when they defeated the Russians in a naval battle. So these were all the great milieu ideas that were bubbling and were feeding this situation. Now the British were very aware of this. And what they did is, in the late 19th century, they created an entity called the Indian National Congress as a kind of safety valve. They say so themselves in their own writings. But the safety valve, by the turn of the century, began to also attract people who were not quite so, let's say, conducive to what the British wanted. This was particularly true of the group that came to be known as the Garam Dal. They were the particular trio of leaders, Lal Bal Pal. But again, often forgotten that there was a fourth person who was a part of that group, and that was, of course, young thinker, writer, Aurobindo Ghosh. Not yet Sri Aurobindo, but at that time, Aurobindo Ghosh. I'm, of course, not going to get too much into the story of Sri Aurobindo and his role as a revolutionary. The reason for that is simple. Many of you already know the story. So the real purpose of my presentation here is to give the wider context of what was going on. So there were obviously many incidents happening. So the traditional way to start this cycle of resistance is from the story of the Chapekar brothers in Pune in June 1987. This is usually considered the first act in the new form of armed revolutionary resistance. What happens is that there is a British official who is in charge of the Plague Commission, and his name is W.C. Rand, and he is using the extraordinary powers he has to stop pandemics in order to essentially carry out fairly draconian kinds of things. So they decide to punish him, and on Ganesh Khend Road, by the way, Ganesh Khend Road still exists, but at that time, as you can see, it was a very lonely road with these trees around it. The Chapekar brothers basically stop his carriage and shoot him dead. Now it causes a big, there's a big manhunt after that. And unfortunately for them, their own relative, one of their own relatives informs the police and they are captured and hung. There is today in Ganesh Khend Road, a very busy road, but there is a small shrine to them in Pune even today. Now, in itself, it did not achieve very much. I mean, one official got killed and those who carried out the attack themselves were hanged. But what happens is that it inspires a whole bunch of people to begin to think differently. And of course, the person who kind of takes up this line of fiery writing is Tilak. Now, while all of this is going on, you have a young Aurobindo Ghosh, who is emerging at that time as a new intellectual. His own background is very interesting. So, many of you will be aware of the Brahmo Samaj, which was an attempt in the mid-20th century in Bengal as a reformist Hindu movement. But by the end of the 19th century, what had happened is that one branch of the Brahmos had basically become lackeys of the British. And what they would do is they were trying very hard to try and prove to the British that they were good citizens and they would sign up to them. And Sriaurobindo's own father came from this line of thought. And he was so keen that his own children became kind of as English as possible. He packed off 3 of his sons off to England to live and be brought up as Englishmen. And their idea was that all of them, but at the very least, Aurobindo Ghosh, who was the most academically talented, would try for the Indian civil service and join the British system. You all know the story, I don't have to tell you. He passed all the exams, but at the last step, he refused to take the riding test and so was disqualified. He did this deliberately because during the course of preparing for the civil service exam, he rediscovered his Indian roots and of course became, as you know, a fiery revolutionary. He instead moved to Baroda, where he became the private secretary and of the Gaikwad king, Sayaji II, who also was a big supporter of various freedom efforts. And later on, he was the vice principal of Baroda College, now known as MS University in Baroda. So while he was living there, he began to think about how a new round of rebellion could be generated. And what he did was he began to look around for models of resistance that had existed in the past. And one of the models of resistance that had worked for hundreds of years, not resistance going back to the resistance to the Turkic invasions, the Mughals and so on, was the network of akhadas that had existed across India from time immemorial. So the advantage of this network was simple, that even if you took out any particular cell of the network, the rest of the network would continue to function. So he and his brother Barin began to now create a network of these akhadas. And so this network came to be known as the Anushilan Samiti. Now, the Anushilan Samiti may sound like a strange name for a revolutionary movement. It literally means the training society. But once you know that they are actually a network of akhadas, it makes complete sense. And his idea, which he has enunciated in one of his pamphlets called Bhavani Mandir, some of you have also probably read it, is that they would basically be in this network functioning out of a temple dedicated to Bhavani and made up of volunteers and warrior monks. Again, you can clearly see the idea deriving out of Anandamath, which itself derived itself from the Sannyasi rebellion. But the Sannyasi rebellion itself has to be seen in the wider context of this Akhada network, which had existed from time immemorial, which had included, for example, the Nath Parampara of yogis at certain points in time. It had included the Juna Akhada and their resistance and so on. And of course, there are versions of this all over India, including in southern India. In Kerala, you have the Kaladi system. Here, I think it's called a Salamam. Yeah. So there is this tradition which exists. So he began to create this network with his, and he at some point left his job in Baroda, moved to Kolkata, and of course began to publish a nationalist newspaper called Vande Mataram. Again, you can see all the linkages. And the idea behind this talk, as you will see, is to show that this was a real movement. To the extent we hear this history, you will notice that you hear about individual heroes, but it's never presented as a movement. So I hope one of the things that will come through is that it had a coherent ideology and there were links and over several generations. And much of that original architecture was created by none other than Sri Aurobindo in his revolutionary period. You can see here that these units of these Anushilan Samiti begin to pop up across India. Some of them have survived to today. Here is one of them in Kolkata. It's called Anushilan Samiti. It was set up in 1902. If you go there, you can see its entry is through this very narrow passage, which is of course not surprising. These were all semi-secret societies. If you go inside it, unfortunately, there's very little left of its original sort of idea, except at the back of the badminton court, you will find this map of undivided India, which is a kind of a reminder of its original purpose. Anyway, this network then now began to spread, many of them across in places like Varanasi, in places like Patna. So not just in Bengal, but in other places, in Nagpur, etc., began to set up. Baring Ghosh, that's Aurobindo Ghosh's brother, then created a kind of headquarters for this in a place called Maniktola, which is then a suburb, northern suburb of the main city of Kolkata, in a garden house. And groups of young men would gather there and exchange revolutionary literature, but more importantly, they at some point began to also accumulate arms, bomb-making facilities and so on. And then they carried out a series of attacks in Bengal. The attacks themselves were not especially successful, but what it did do, unfortunately for this group, was it alerted the British intelligence to the existence of this movement, that it was not just about writing in the newspapers. There was some hard sort of network that was emerging, and there was a huge crackdown, which led to, of course, the Alipur bomb case, which again, I don't have to explain to this audience. I went, by the way, to Maniktola to try and find where exactly this garden house used to be, and I just couldn't find it. That location is now quite densely packed, and you can't imagine a garden house there of any kind. There is, however, a somewhat open field called Bomamat, which literally means the field of bombs. And locals tell me, but I couldn't find hard evidence for it. Locals tell me that this was part of the garden house's lands, and right now it's used for locals playing football or having a local fair or whatever, just a general open space. But this is supposedly one part of that garden house complex. I just couldn't find any proper remains of that garden house. I've seen photographs, but nothing was there. Anyway, this whole episode didn't this sort of the first generation, so to speak, of the Anushilan Samiti got kind of disrupted with the Alipur bomb case. Baring Ghosh himself and others like Ullas Gaddat were sent off to Andamans, to Port Blair, to the cellular jail. Aurobindo Ghosh himself, of course, escaped to Chandannagar and, of course, made his way to Pondicherry. And many members were captured, some were hung, and so on and so forth. So this first generation, you would think, did not get anywhere. But by this time, the idea had spread. And it had spread not just within India, but also even outside India. And one of the places where it spread was to a hostel for Indian students in London called India House. This was set up by a businessman called Shyamji Krishna Verma as a hostel for Indian students who were studying in London. And in the mid-decade of the first decade of the 20th century, there were a bunch of charismatic young students who were living there, led by Veer Savarkar, Vinayak Savarkar, later known as Veer Savarkar. Vinayak Savarkar, and he had a whole group of students that he inspired, including VVS Iyer, who would come and spend some time here, incidentally, with Sri Aurobindo later on, and Madan Lal Dhingra and many others. They would come here, Hardayal. They would come here, and for a while, this became a hotbed of revolutionary thoughts, etc. What happens next, however, is that Madan Lal Dhingra, who was one of Savarkar's disciples, decides to become much more radical, and he begins to collect guns and so on. Now, while all of this is going on, there is also other revolutionaries that are emerging. You have Sardar Singh Rana in Paris. He was a very rich businessman as well. He sets up a group there, and he brings together another group of revolutionaries, including Bhikhaji Kama, a very famous Parsi lady who became one of the most ardent supporters of Savarkar. And so they begin to now create a network. They connect through to other groups, for example, the Irish revolutionaries who are also fighting the British, and so on. So a very big network begins to emerge out of all of this. I went to, again, some of the places where they used to live. The left picture is where Sardar Singh Rana used to live. It's a beautiful house. It still is a residential complex. But I went to Bhikhaji Kama's house, which is now, unfortunately, the old house is gone. So there's a modern house there. So just to give you a flavor of the kinds of what these places look like. Meanwhile, as I told you, Madan Lal Dhingra was beginning to put together a collection of arms, and VVS Iyer and so on. And these young men sitting in India House were basically at that time planning to carry out some revolutionary acts. But unfortunately for them, there was already living inside that building a spy, a British spy. He was the young students actually caught him in the act. They threatened him, and then what they did is quite interesting. In exchange for not killing him, they said that they would begin to write the reports on his behalf. So for several months, Savarkar and his team would sit around the dinner table and write all kinds of bizarre things as reports to the British intelligence. British intelligence then began to keep, undercover officers to keep track of this house, which I showed you, India House. It still exists, by the way. This is the place actually. This is the house. It's still there. There's a plaque there in their memory. And and of course the students knew who they were, because they could tell that these were not from the neighborhood. So what they would do is, just to tease them, they would go up and ask for a match to light their cigarette, and or tell them where they were going and tell them, be there by so and so time. And so just generally mess around with them, as you can imagine college students would do. But things got a lot more serious in 1909, when Madan Lal Dhingra decided to carry out an assassination of a senior official of the British government, in what is now Imperial College, but was then known as Imperial Institute. There's nothing much left of the original building except that bell tower that is still there. And of course, this assassination was an absolute sensation. And very quickly, they traced it back to Savarkar. And Savarkar escaped to Paris. He obviously already had a network there. But unfortunately, he decided to go back to London. Now, there is a big debate about why he decided to do this, but he was captured when he went back to London on the railway station. And he was then sent off to India to face trial because the evidence against him was not very strong. And so if they had done the trial in London, he might have got away with a light sentence. So they decided to transport him back to India to face a trial in India. And on his way back, the ship on which he was being carried, it stopped in Marseille. And so in Marseille, Savarkar managed to squeeze out of one of the windows and jump into the sea and actually swam to the harbor on the pier, and then he began to run. The reason he did this is that Bhikhaji Kama, who I had mentioned earlier, was supposed to turn up and pick him up and whisk him away. Unfortunately, she was delayed by a railway crossing and arrived literally 5 minutes late. And so he was recaptured by the crew. Actually, was recaptured by a policeman, a French policeman from Marseille, who didn't quite understand what was going on and handed him back to the British, who of course promptly put him back into the boat and brought him to India. And then he faced a trial and he was sent off to Cellular Jail in Port Blair. But it did become a very major international incident because effectively the British had captured somebody on French soil. And so this case went all the way to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And it became a very major international incident. I'm telling you this because you are here in Pondicherry. And of course, Sri Aurobindo was staying here using the exact same protections. So this is a history you should know, that Savarkar did attempt to use that to kind of wriggle out. But unfortunately, he was already back in the ship in India and had been and was sent off to Kalapani. Now, while this was the first generation of the revolutionary movement, Sri Aurobindo and Savarkar, and in somewhat different ways, they were no longer a part of the system by 1910. But the spirit of revolution had already spread, and it had inspired a whole bunch of new generation. And this new generation was led by a very charismatic young man, again from a French enclave in Chandannagar, called Raj Bihari Bose. And Raj Bihari Bose created his own network. He was then, incidentally, teaching in Dehradun at the Forestry Research Institute there. That institute is still there. And he created a plot to take out the Viceroy on a major event, which was the ceremonial entry of Delhi in 1912 December. What was the significance? Well, basically, in 1911, the British had announced that they were shifting their capital from Kolkata to Delhi. So in 1912, they did a ceremonial entry on an elephant and everything, the whole band baja. And at that event, Raj Bihari Bose and Basant Biswas basically threw a bomb on the Viceroy and nearly killed him. He didn't die though. His Mahout died, but he did not die. But he was laid in hospital for almost 6 months. Lord Hardinge, who was then the Viceroy. And again, as you can imagine, this caused a sensation. Raj Bihari Bose escaped by train back to where he was working in Dehradun at the Forestry Research Institute. This is not the grand building that you see there today. That was built later. There's a smaller place, that building is still there, not used though. And he was basically working there as in the laboratory there. Very convenient place to build bombs, as you can imagine. And nobody guessed that it was him, because in his public life he would always pretend to be a big loyalist. So much so that when 6 months later the Lord Hardinge recovered from his injuries and he came to Dehradun for some official visit, it was Raj Bihari Bose who was put in charge of the welcome committee. But at some point they began to catch on to what was going on. Basanta Biswas was captured again, unfortunately, because he was actually turned in by his own uncle. But anyway, now that he had been discovered, Raj Bihari Bose had to essentially go underground, and he began to basically go around to various hideouts. And one of the places he made his way to was to Bengali Tola in Varanasi, where the Sanyal family was living. Now, the Sanyals, which is actually my own family, were living in Varanasi for quite some time. They had moved there in the 1770s, 1780s. They had basically been involved in some fashion in the Sannyasi rebellion, and obviously had come out on the losing side. So at somewhere in the 1770s, 1780s, they moved to Varanasi, which had not yet been taken over by the British. It was still under a Raja called Raja Chet Singh. And they set up a neighborhood there called Bengali Tola. So that Tola is a Vedic school. So they set up a Vedic school, and as a part of that, they also set up akhadas. As I tell you, akhadas are a very important part of the story. And they began to train young men, mostly, not too many women would have been part of this, but young men in martial arts training in that whole region as an idea, as a part of the rebellion. They also set up, interestingly, a school which still exists called Bengali Tola Inter College, which was set up in 1853. The idea was to learn English, because their idea was that without technology, you could not beat the Europeans. So you need to know their language to learn their technology, but they were not keen on learning it from the missionary schools. So they set up their own schools, and that school still exists, called Bengali Tola Inter College. So this is where this was kind of a neighborhood of mostly one interconnected family. So there was the Sanyals themselves, but also over time they brought relatives like the Lahiris. You may have heard of the Yogi Shamacharan Lahiri. So part of the same family. And so this network of sort of small thin lanes, akhadas, etc., was where Raj Bihari Bose began to operate from. And what was he trying to do? What they were trying to do, as we were now approaching the First World War, was to cause a rebellion in the British Indian Army, sort of a rerun of the 1857 rebellion. And they knew that there was already 1914, a lot of recruitment is going on, and they wanted to create this rebellion. And it wasn't just in India that they were operating across the world. For example, in the west coast of Canada and the US, where they were in touch with a network of Sikhs called Gadar movement. You may have heard of the Gadarites. So the Gadarites, who were then there was a newsletter called The Gadar, done by Lala Hardayal, who was also one of Savarkar's followers, who had landed up there and was living there in San Francisco. And so there was this big network that was building up. So the Gadar movement, as you can see, many of them were students in the San Francisco area, in the Stockton and Vancouver area. And you can see that they were very active. They pooled together money. Some of them had made some money in agriculture and logging. And so they pooled together money. In fact, they even bought a house. That location, by the way, was recently purchased. The old house is gone, but the location was purchased recently, not recently, but a few years ago by the Indian government. And there's a small museum to them in San Francisco. And that is Lala Hardayal, who was kind of running all of this. Now, this network, not surprisingly, as the First World War took off, began to be supported by the Germans. And so the Germans began to find ways to try and land guns on the Indian coast, in fact in Odisha. And so you have this network of revolutionaries in India led by Rajbihari Bose, and by this point his chief assistant was Sachindranath Sanyal, one of the people whose portraits is here. Sachindranath Sanyal and Rajbihari now basically began to run this, and they were joined by another great revolutionary called Bagha Jatin. And they began to be landing these arms in Odisha to try and get these, and a lot of this supplied by the Germans, interestingly, through the US, because the US had not yet joined this movement. The British, by the way, were fully aware of all of this going on. They sent somebody called Hopkinson, an intelligence officer, to infiltrate the Gurudwaras. And so he began to basically try and separate out Sikh identity from the Hindu identity. And a lot of this happened in Canada. So in case you want to know why the Khalistani movement has its hub in Canada, it has a lot to do with its original founder, an intelligence officer called Hopkinson. The Sikhs, of course, knew what was going on, and so they began to hunt down many of these collaborationist, loyalist Sikhs and shoot them dead. And in response, the leader of the loyalists, a guy called Bela Singh, began to hunt the Gadarites. So there was inside the Gurudwaras, there were literal gunfights. And Bela Singh then carried out in broad daylight, shot a whole bunch of Gadarites, and it became a case. So they were taken to court, but it was quite clear that Hopkinson would basically find a way to let them off the hook. So they were in court in British Columbia. This case was going in, and Hopkinson was supposed to speak up on favor of Bela Singh, stating that he did it in self-defense and so on, when another Gadarite, Sardar Meva Singh Lapoke, got up and shot Hopkinson dead in court. So this was the sort of thing that was going on. Meva Singh was later hanged, but Bela Singh found it so difficult to hang around in British Columbia, because the Gadarites were hunting him all the time, and many of his associates were getting killed, that he actually fled back to India, where he thought he would be better disguised. But he was hunted down there and also killed. Anyway, this rebellion in the First World War was supposed to start on 15th of February 1915. Unfortunately, the British found out there was a mole inside their planning group who informed British intelligence. And so, just a few hours before the rebellion was supposed to start, the British changed all the guards of all the armories to European guards. So there wasn't a proper rebellion. There was in a few places small rebellions, but the rebellion itself did not get going because the Indian troops were basically disarmed and then shipped out to Gallipoli and other places where, it was only, they were given back their rifles only when they reached. But there were a few rebellions, small ones, but most interestingly, the place it happened was in Singapore. For about a week, the Indian regiment in Singapore rebelled and held Singapore. Again, people do not know about this in February 2015. And ironically, it was put down with the help of Japanese Marines who happened to be in the area, because in the First World War, the Japanese were on the Allied side. So it was actually put down that rebellion was put down by the Japanese. Anyway, many of the members who were involved in the Gadar movement were shot dead, killed, hanged, etc. The chief instigators were Rajbihari Bose. He escaped to Japan, where he would make a living from running an Indian restaurant. So he ran the first Indian restaurant in Japan. That restaurant, interestingly, still exists. You can still go there and eat Rajbihari Bose's recipe of chicken curry. He would marry a Japanese lady and continue to live there. Meanwhile, Sachindranath Sanyal, the other co-conspirator, was captured and sent off to cellular jail. He was already considered too big a leader to be hanged and converted into a martyr, so they sent him off to cellular jail. Now that was not a fun thing to happen to you. As you can see, cellular jail, there's, by the way, if you go to cellular jail, at that time there were already some major leaders there. Baring Ghosh was there, Savarkar was there, and now Sachindranath Sanyal were there. Many others were there, Ullaskar Dutt and so on. If you go there, there are two cells that are dedicated, by the way. Of course, many greats were there, but two cells that are dedicated. One of them is Savarkar cell and the other is to Sachindranath Sanyal. There are two dedicated cells in their name, although, as I said, they were probably moved around quite a lot. So I am not 100% sure that the exact cells which are marked out are necessarily theirs. And they were subjected to continuous torture. They had to run this, oil mill, which they had to keep turning for all days in the sun. And they would be whipped if they slowed down. Some of them passed out from the exhaustion, and what would happen is their hands would be tied to the mill, and then other prisoners would be made to run it round and round. Sometimes they would be simply chained to the wall and left there for days, and of course subjected to all manner of horrible tortures, including electrocution and so on. So this is what cellular jail looks like. As you can see, a small part of it is still there. This is again, went there some years ago, and you can see it lists out all the names of those who were there. Sachindranath Sanyal is prominently there because he would be, and as I will tell you, he was later sent back there as well. Now what happens is that all the soldiers that were supposed to have rebelled in 1915 began to come back to India in 1919 after the First World War was over. But the British were very, very afraid that this same people who had nearly rebelled in 1915, now they are coming back. They are now experienced soldiers. Even more dangerously for context of the time, they were not afraid of killing Europeans. So they had got used to the idea of killing Germans, and so this was something that the British colonial officials were very afraid of, that they're going to come back and they're going to rebel. So in this context, they introduced these very draconian laws called the Rowlatt Acts. The Rowlatt Acts were a direct response to a danger of a Gatherite rebellion. And this is the context in which a major crackdown happened in Punjab, particularly other places as well, but specifically in Punjab, to make sure that, the population was kept afraid of any kind of attempt to rebel. There were many acts of genocide, including bombing from the air and so on. But the most famous episode, of course, is the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which you all know about. Now, after that Jallianwala Bagh massacre, it became a very big national and international episode. And in an attempt to kind of calm things down, the British actually released some of the prisoners from cellular jail. That included Baring Ghosh, but for our purposes, very importantly, it included Sachindranath Sanyal. Sachindranath Sanyal basically came back to India, to the mainland, went back to Varanasi, and promptly went back to to organizing the revolutionary movement. At that time, remember what is going on. We have the non-cooperation movement being led by Gandhi, has then become the dominant. He has replaced Tilak and the others to become the biggest leader by this point. But Sachin Sanyal and the old revolutionaries, some of the revolutionaries joined the non-cooperation movement as well. But Sachindranath Sanyal kept his distance because he was always somewhat suspicious of this particular. He wasn't convinced. So, when after Chauri Chaura the non-cooperation movement collapsed, he began to reorganize all these, the old Anushilan network. And he reorganized them into a new group, which he called the Hindustan Republican Association, and under it, the Hindustan Republican Army, which he formed in 1923. The t-shirt I'm wearing is in memory of this group. And he also wrote his own memoirs called Bandi Jeevan, first in Bangla, but also later translated it to Hindi, which talked about the Gadarite phase of the revolutionary movement, and that went viral in today's parlance as underground literature. So it was translated into many languages by other revolutionaries, including into Punjabi, I think by no less than Bhagat Singh and others. So it became really a big thing. It was he in this phase who recruited the next generation of revolutionaries. So you had the first generation, Savarkar, sriaurobindo. Second generation was Sajjannath Sanyal, Hardayal, Rajbihari, and so on, and the Gadarites. Now Sajjan Sanyal comes back and recruits the third generation. And the third generation was Bismil, Ashfaqullah Khan, Rajendra Lahiri, that generation of revolutionaries under the banner of Masterdar Surya Sen, many of these, of this Republican HSA. He also incidentally recruited the subsequent generation as well, who were very young. They were teenagers at that time. That was Azad, Bhagat Singh, and others. So he literally during this phase recruited two generations of revolutionaries. Now, they had a problem in that they didn't have any guns, because in the First World War, the Germans had attempted to supply them guns by landing them along the coastline. Most of them had been caught by the British. Any case now, that particular phase had died out, so they didn't have any guns. So what were they going to do? So they went off, what they did is they sent a swimmer to Stuttgart on a swimming competition. And what the real agenda was to actually negotiate a supply of Mauser pistols, the pistol that is here on my... And this was the favorite pistol of the revolutionaries. They had they already had some supplies of them, but they wanted now bigger supplies. And so they decided that they would get them in a boat into the Bay of Bengal. And Rajendra Lahiri went out in a fishing boat and picked them up. And so that's how they were getting this supply of Mauser pistols. There was only a minor problem. They had no money to pay for it. So what do? They decided, therefore, in 1925, to rob a train outside Lucknow in a place called Kakodi. Same place, Kakodi kebab, same place. And they robbed the train very successfully. And what happened in there is that they picked up a safe full of tax collection. So at that time, the train used to have even later it had a guard sort of bogie at the end of the train, and that guard coach would have the tax safe where the government taxes would be sent back and forth. So they figured out that they had found out that this particular train, which had this safe with a lot of money in it, was going to go through this Kakodi area towards Lucknow. So they stopped it, they robbed it, and they took a lot of money. Some of it did indeed get used to pay off the loans they had taken for buying the guns, but they had some excess money as well. And so, they finally had some good resources. So the robbery itself was actually quite successful. The problem, of course, again, was the British intelligence now caught on to them. And interestingly, at that time, notes, in the 19th century, mostly were using coins. So it was now a new thing to use notes. And the notes were numbered. The revolutionaries particularly did not, I'm speaking here specifically of Bismil, who was the main character who was running this operation. He did not realize that they were numbered. And so the British were able to trace the numbers back to the revolutionaries. And this generation of revolutionaries, Bismil, Ashfaqullah Khan and Rajendra Lahiri were captured and then they were hanged. This is known as the Kakodi case. Sachindranath Sanyal was again sent back to Kalapani. So he's the only revolutionary to have been sent back to Kalapani twice. And he would stay there for a decade after this in Kalapani. And so suddenly the movement found itself that the third generation of revolutionaries was also suddenly disappeared. And it ended up in the hands of very, very young revolutionaries, at that time teenagers, Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, and a few others. Yes. Baring Ghosh kind of became not so active as an active revolutionary. He would continue to write and do other things, but he no longer participated as one of the leaders of the movement after that. I think he even moved at some point and came and stayed here. Yeah. So he kind of drifted off away from the movement, the active movement. Now what happens is that this movement is now beginning to fracture. There is no central authority like Sachin Sanyal holding it together. And so one branch of it, which is in northern India, comes to call itself the Hindustan Socialist Revolutionary Movement. By this time, new ideologies are beginning to filter in. So you have Marxist and socialist ideas are spreading. The earlier generation would not have read Marx, for example. But now you have somebody like, for the first time, somebody like Bhagat Singh, who actually begins to read Marxist literature. Interestingly, many of the other were vehemently anti-Marxist, including Sachindranath Sanyal himself, but also many of his colleagues. In fact, Bhagat Singh writes this in one of his pamphlets called Why I Am an Atheist. He writes that, in fact, other than himself, pretty much everybody else was, a nationalist. And much of the driving force of this, by the way, so far had actually been Shakta philosophy of Shaktism. Now, in the course of this period, you will remember the Lal Bal Pal trio. Well, Tilak had passed away by this point. Pal had become less active, I think for health reasons. But Lala Lajpat Rai was still a very big leader. What happens is that there is I think it was 1929, there is a protest in Lahore where he is so badly beaten, particularly in the head, that he dies of his injuries. And so the Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev Thapar and Shivram Rajguru decide that they are going to avenge his death. So they actually go and go to the police station where the British officials, British officers who had carried out that attack, and they kill one of the police officers who had attacked Lala Lajpat Rai. And not surprisingly, the British now begin to look for them. There is a very interesting story about how they escaped from Lahore under those circumstances. Essentially, there is Durga Bhabi, who was actually the wife of another revolutionary. She dresses up as the wife of Bhagat Singh, who then dresses up as a sort of upper middle class gentleman. He was reasonably educated and came from a relatively wealthy background, so he could sort of pass it off. And you had the others sort of dress up as his servants and this and that. So they go as a sort of like a big family. They get into the train along with Durga Bhabi and Durga Bhabi's son. And they go to Kolkata, and that's how they escape by train. They reach Kolkata and then they disperse. But meanwhile, the movement is gathering more and more pace. And there are several other sort of attacks and things that happen. For example, in around about this general time, you have a rebellion in Chattogram called the Armory Raid, where Masterdar takes over the armory in Chattogram. There is a huge gunfight up in the hills near Chattogram, in Jalalabad Hill, and so on. There are many other things that are also happening. So you have to remember, this is not in isolation. this movement seems to be again spiraling up. And amidst all of this, Bhagat Singh and Batukeshwar Dutt decide to go and throw a bomb in the Legislative Assembly, which later became the Parliament of India, but then was a newly inaugurated building. And they went to the speaker's section and threw a bomb. The intention there was not so much to kill anyone, because this was a bomb that made a lot of noise. But they then distributed a lot of revolutionary literature and so on. And again, it caused quite a sensation. So the idea was really to sort of project the movement. Just before going to for this, do remember that Bhagat Singh knew that if he was captured, they would very quickly trace it back to the Saunders killing in Lahore, and that he would probably be hanged for it. So he went to Qudsiya Park, which is North Delhi. There's still a park, and he kind of had a last meal as a free man. And so I actually visited that place as well. Anyway, so he was captured. They very quickly figured out that, and they also captured Sukhdev Thapar and Rajguru soon after that. And then they were condemned to death. They were taken to a place called Hussainiwala. They were, I think, hanged in Lahore and their bodies were taken to Hussainiwala, where they were cremated. There is in Hussainiwala a shrine to them. This is right on the border with Pakistan today. In fact, at partition, this had ended up on the Pakistani side, and the Indians actually exchanged it by giving up some land, and they took Hussainiwala back. There is a shrine there to it. This shrine, unfortunately, in the 1965 war, the Pakistanis actually desecrated this site, so it had to be rebuilt. Anyway, now, as you can see, they're already depleting a lot of people. People getting shot, hanged, etc. Now, the only senior leader of the movement that was still at large was Chandrasekhar Azad. He was, again, very, very young, in his early 20s, and he's now the leader of the movement. And so he is now moving around, and the British are aware of him. And so what happens is, by this point, by the way, remember the Sanyal families were living in Varanasi, in Bengali Tola, and all their family property has been taken away. And they have been thrown out of their confiscated, they've been thrown out. Many male members of the family are in jail. So one branch of the family, my branch of the family actually, ended up in what was then called Allahabad, now called Prayagraj. And they were living in an area called Karnalganj. Another branch went off to Gorakhpur. And so I know this from memories of that time. Pratibha Sanyal, who is Sachin Sanyal's wife, was living there as well, as were his brothers. And they were expecting Chandrasekhar Azad to visit them that day, when they noticed that the lane in which they lived in Karnalganj had a whole bunch of armed policemen. So they knew that something was afoot. It was not uncommon for the British to keep track of this house. And in fact, what used to happen is that revolutionaries would come in. They had timed how much time it took for the informant to go to the police station and bring the police. And so what they would do is, within that time, which was I think 10 minutes or whatever it was, the revolutionaries would dump their laundry, pick up their fresh laundry, eat a meal, leave any messages or take any messages they have, and then there was a back path to escaping, and they would escape from there using the roofs of connected roofs. So that is what they were expecting to do, but unfortunately by this point Chandrasekhar Azad they knew what he looked like, and they knew he was going to be captured. And so we're waiting for him, trying to figure out how to get a message to him, when they began to hear a gunfight that was happening in a park next door in Alfred Park, now called Chandrasekhar Azad Park. What had happened was that the movement had been infiltrated by, again, informants. One of them, by the way, was a person who later became a very famous Hindi writer called Yashpal. And Yashpal provided information to the British about Chandrasekhar Azad. He was then trapped in this park, and as you will famously know, there was a gunfight, and when he ran out of ammo in the last bullet, he shot himself dead, because he had promised that he would be never taken alive. So with his last bullet, he killed himself. The spot where he killed himself is still, there is a memorial to Chandrasekhar Azad. Similarly, there were rebellions going on. There was a gunfight in Writers' Building in Kolkata when and Dinesh Gupta, Ramkrishna Bishash, Dinesh Majumdar, all of them were then hanged in Alipur jail, which is now the Alipur Central Jail, which is now a memorial to them, and so on. As I already mentioned, there was a big rebellion in Chattogram a little about that time. And so again, another round. So now you are 4 generations in, okay? And the British have still not left. All the top leaders have either been killed or eliminated, or they are, in the case of Raj Bihari Bose, living in Japan. And so the 1930s were a very, till about 1938, there is a lull in the movement. Everybody is exhausted. The Indian, even the peaceful non-cooperation movement also was quite exhausted in the early 1930s. But nonetheless, you begin to see by the late 1930s, another new anticipation happens. Where several things happen at the same time. First of all, Sachindranath Sanyal is finally released from jail after spending more than 10 years in captivity. And he comes back to India, at least the mainland of India, and immediately gets back to doing whatever he was doing before, which is to create a new network. So in 1937, he's back, and he begins to receive these messages, letters from Raj Bihari Bose saying that, look, very likely we're going to have another world war. The Japanese are going to be involved. We're not quite sure how, but they will be involved. Let's begin to plan to see if the rebellion we had tried in the First World War can now be attempted in the Second World War. So Sachin Sanyal sets back to work. But who are his, because remember, he's been away for a long time. His network is all gone. So he sets himself up in Varanasi house is gone. He operates now out of Allahabad and Lucknow and Gorakhpur. That is now his place. And of course, out of Chandan Nagar, Kolkata. These are the places he's now operating from. And there is a very famous meeting because now Raj Bihari writes to Sachin Sanyal and said that, you know, the key person you must cooperate with is a new leader we now have called Subhash Bose. So Subhash Bose had emerged by this point as a dominant, prominent leader, and he had in fact even become for a while the president of the Indian National Congress. But the Gandhi faction in the party would evict him, even though he fully won his election the second time. But the Gandhi function didn't allow him to function. He basically was forced to resign. So here he was in 1938, basically after his resignation and a bit of a limb, when the revolutionaries now contact him to say, you know, come and join hands with us. And there is a Durga Puja that happens in Lucknow. It's the oldest one. It still happens in Young Men's Association, which is basically the descendant of the Akhadas. This is the oldest puja in Lucknow. And then in the sidelines of the Durga Puja, Sachin Sanyal and Subhash Bose actually have a secret meeting. Now, interestingly, the Japanese representative also attended that meeting. This is not widely known, but it was witnessed by Sachin Sanyal's son, my uncle, who related to me later that he was witness to this meeting between these three great leaders. And so already in 1938, just remember, First World War has not started even in Europe. The Second World War has not even started in Europe, but they're already beginning to think. So this is important to know, because very often people think that, this idea of the Indian National Army, Azad Hind Fauj and all of that suddenly happened out of thin air. It didn't happen out of thin air. The revolutionaries had attempted to do this before in the First World War. And in anticipation of Second World War, they were already beginning to think about all of this.
And we have letters. Some of these letters are in exhibit now in the Victoria Memorial Museum, where there is a section now dedicated to the revolutionaries called the Biplabi Bharat Museum. So this was there. So all of this was happening, and then of course the war starts. Remember, as I said, in the First World War, the Germans had been a big support. So this time, the Germans, of course, they connect with the Germans, but they also connect with the Japanese this time. And so the revolutionaries are very much an international movement. They're also in touch, by the way, with the Irish, who had already become an independent country. So this is not only to be seen as an India-focused thing. There were a very large network that was going on at that time. Now, while all of this is going on, Indians have not forgotten O'Dwyer and Dyer, who had carried out the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. And while all these luminaries of the Hindustan Republican Association and later the Hindustan Socialist Republican Socialist Association, while the top leaders were either arrested or dead, etc., individuals of that institution were still floating around. And one of those people was Udham Singh. So Udham Singh, who was a big fan of Bhagat Singh and others, he continued to operate, and he began to look for how to actually assassinate Dyer and O'Dwyer in London. Unfortunately, by the time he got his plan together, Reginald Dyer died of natural causes, so he wasn't there. So he decided that he will target his boss, O'Dwyer, in London. And in fact, on 13th of March in 1940, Udham Singh basically assassinated O'Dwyer in this place, which is called Caxton Hall in London. Caxton Hall still exists, although it's not a hall now, it's a residential complex. If any of you go to Buckingham Palace and you happen to visit the Taj Hotel, which is right next to St. James Court Hotel, this is literally 100 meters away. So please go and see Caxton Hall. I was there a few years ago and stood on the steps there, and me and a friend sang the full version of the Vande Mataram on the steps in memory of this event. Udham Singh was immediately captured. He would be then hanged for doing this. Interestingly, he was hanged in exactly the same place where a generation earlier Madan Lal Dhingra had been hanged. So they were hanged from the same gallows. Both Punjabis from Amritsar hanged from the same place for carrying out an assassination of an official in London. Many years later, their ashes were brought back to India, and the ashes of Udham Singh and Madan Lal Dhingra are now in India. I think Udham Singh's is now displayed in the Jallianwala Bagh memorial. Now what is going on, as this is now territory which is somewhat better known history. The British are clearly suspicious of what's going on. It's not that they don't know that the revolutionaries are up to something. So what they do is they arrest both Sachindranath Sanyal and Netaji. Sachin Sanyal is then deliberately infected with TB in jail, and he would die of TB a few years later, 1 or 2 years later. But of course, we know that Subhash Bose, by now known as Netaji Subhash Bose, would escape very dramatically from house arrest from Kolkata, make his way through Afghanistan to Germany, and then from Germany by submarine to Asia, to Singapore, Japan, etc. But before he got there, it is forgotten that it was Raj Bihari Bose who actually set up the Indian National Army. So what happens is that the Japanese capture Singapore. Large numbers of Indian soldiers actually surrender. Then they are given a choice to join a new revolutionary army called the Indian National Army, or the Azad Hind Fauj. This Azad Hind Fauj, by the way, as I said, was not set up by Netaji as is popular believed. It was actually set up by the old revolutionary who had escaped to Japan, Raj Bihari Bose. And he then organized this. Unfortunately, by this point, Raj Bihari Bose was quite an old man and his health was failing him. So it is he who requested the Japanese government to ask the Germans for Netaji Subhash Bose. So on his request, Netaji Subhash Bose was sent by submarine to the Indian Ocean, where he switched to the Japanese submarine. He was brought to Singapore. And so you can see here in Singapore, on the Padang, in the middle of Singapore, they had this big march past of the Indian National Army. There was a memorial that was also set up there. That memorial was later pulled down by the British. So there is now a second memorial there, if you go there, in Singapore, commemorating the foundation of the Indian National Army. The Indian National Army, of course, participated in the Second World War as part of the Japanese attack on British India. They would make their way through to Nagaland and more directly into Manipur. The flag of Azad Hind would be actually put up in a place called Moirang in Manipur. So there was a part of mainland India that was indeed liberated by them. They were also de jure in charge of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which is very symbolic because, of course, the cellular jail was there, and Netaji also visited cellular jail during his time when it was de jure under his rule. The war ends. The INA, of course, is on the losing side of this whole episode. And very famously, there is a plane crash in which, depending on what your beliefs are, either Netaji Subhash Chandra perished in that plane crash in Taipei, or he used that to escape and was never seen ever again. So I'm not going to get into that controversy, but what did happen is, and we know this for sure, is that, of course, the rebellion ends look at what has happened to the rebels. They tried in the 1910s in the first generation, didn't work out, very small. Much bigger rebellion in the First World War under the Ghadarites and Raj Bihari and Sachin Sanyal, does not work out. Then in the interwar period, they tried 2 rounds, first under the Hindustan Republican Association, and then later under Master Da and Bhagat Singh and so on. Again fails miserably. They try a 5th time, you can see, with the INA and Azad Hind Fauj, and that too has failed. But have they failed? Because now the whole story goes into a totally different direction. The British basically march the surrendered soldiers of the INA back to Delhi, and they decide that, look, we're going to make an example out of these guys by sort of prosecuting them and putting them to death. Just what they had done all these years was basically, made a big spectacle of hanging all these revolutionaries. We'll do it again. It had worked in 1857. It had worked all these years, going to happen again. So they bring all these soldiers and their officers to the Red Fort in Delhi. And there's a famous Red Fort case where they put many of these officers, but very famously Shah Nawaz Khan, Colonel Gurbakht Singh and Dhillon and Prem Kumar Sehgal, they put them on trial. And it becomes a sensation. It turns out to be a major strategic error by the British because, you see, during the war itself, most Indians had never heard of the INA because of censorship. And suddenly, because of these trials, suddenly most Indians actually hear about it. And not only do they hear about it, the soldiers of the British Indian Army, the Navy, and so on also hear about it. And there is an absolute sensation in this that actually there had been an army of liberation led by no less than Netaji Subhash Bose, a very charismatic leader who had actually entered India. They had, of course, been defeated, but they had managed to enter India. It caused an absolute sensation. Now, this is not a trivial problem for the British, because remember what is happening in 1946. In 1946, the war has been won, but all the Western powers are absolutely exhausted from this war. The soldiers of the British Army, the American Army, the French, everybody, they had left their normal lives, joined the army. They now wanted to go home. They had been at war for 5 years. Millions of them had been killed, and they just wanted to go home. So the British, and meanwhile, the government in Britain had also changed. Churchill had lost the elections. You had a new Labour government in place, and these soldiers were all going home. So what was happening in Asia was that everything from Egypt through, of course, the Indian subcontinent, through Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, all the way through to southern Vietnam, was actually controlled by the British Indian soldiers. Not by European soldiers, but by the British Indian Army. And there was every chance of a rebellion. For example, in Indonesia, the Japanese, just before surrendering, had handed all their weapons to the Indonesian revolutionaries. So in Java, there were a huge bunch of battles against any attempt to bring back the Dutch colonial government. So when the Dutch colonial government were unable to take control, they asked the British to provide them soldiers. And what soldiers did they provide? They provided the British Indian soldiers. So suddenly the Indian soldiers were fighting in Indonesia against Indonesians for protecting or bringing back the colonial masters, not just of the British, but even of their friends, the Dutch. And similarly, in what is now Vietnam, and so on. So there is a lot of grumbling of unhappiness in the British Indian Army. Why on earth are we fighting and killing and dying for somebody else's kingdom? And remember, these are not young newbies. They have fought in a war. These are serious soldiers, battle hardened. And so there is all this grumbling of rebellion that is happening. And the British are also very afraid that Netaji Subhash Bose may suddenly pop up from somewhere and lead this rebellion. So not only will they lose their Indian empire, but they will have actually gifted Netaji an empire across the all of Asia. I mean, Egypt was controlled by British Indian soldiers. The Indian subcontinent was. Much of the Gulf was. As I said, Southeast Asia was. So inadvertently, the British would have actually created an Indian empire. So they were this was the driving sort of thinking of this. So they began to think about what to do about this. And this is the context in which you have to remember the discussions about partition and so on. Now, while all of this is going on, in February 1946, there is a major rebellion in Mumbai in the Royal Indian Navy. So everybody was looking and trying to control the army, and they were expecting a rebellion in the army. But actually, ultimately, the rebellion actually didn't happen in the army. It started in the Navy. Again, an episode that is oddly left out of our textbooks. But this may be the single most important event that led to Indian independence a year later. This is the Royal Indian Navy rebellion in February 1946. And what happens is that some 20,000 sailors of the Royal Indian Navy go in strike. They take control of 80 odd ships in Bombay Harbor. They are in control of all the communications. Remember, they are fully armed. These are not kids. These are people who had fought in a war just a few weeks earlier. And there is a genuine danger of this spreading. So you have a similar rebellion happens in Karachi port, in Kolkata. There are other rumblings of revolt in Jabalpur in the army. So the British then decide that, they have to be put down, and they call in the Maratha regiment to kind of, at least the shore establishments, to take it back. So the Maratha regiment turns up in front of, if you go there, there is INS Angre. It's a shore establishment in fort area. They take positions in the old RBI building, not the tall one we have now. There's an old RBI building. They take positions and they begin to shoot towards the Navy positions. This shooting goes on for some time till the British officials realize something very strange, that from all the shooting, nobody on the Navy side seems to be getting killed. It was quite obvious that the Marathas were shooting to miss. So they send an official up to the top of and by the way, same thing is happening the other way. Those guys also shooting, nobody is getting hit. So they send a British officer to the top of the RBI building to see what on earth is going on. And he promptly gets shot dead. And it's not very clear who shot him dead. So at this point, they realize it's a very dangerous situation. So they withdraw the Marathas. Then they put the Lancaster regiment. It's a European regiment. And there's a big gunfight and they take back. But meanwhile, the ships are all loaded and they do fire some volleys into the city. And but of course, they realize that if they bombard the city, most of the people who get killed are their fellow Indians. So there is a big problem here. Meanwhile, the Royal Indian Air Force, the Spitfires, are called for from Delhi. That's where they were based. So the squadrons take off from Delhi. They couldn't those days they couldn't fly very long distances. So the Spitfires take off. They land in Jodhpur. They refuel, and then mysteriously all of them develop engine trouble. So you can see what is happening. The British officials know that the situation is completely going out of their control. And there is already in Jabbalpur and other places, sounds of rebellion. So this is the context. It is during this naval revolt that the British government announces the Commission on Indian Independence. The Cabinet Commission on Indian Independence happens during this naval revolt. It's a very, very major event in Indian history. As I said, because this event is entirely related to the history of the revolutionaries, it was later essentially basically suppressed. So many people here, Indians, may not even have heard about this event. And it's not there in our textbooks. And it's only very recently when people myself have researched it and began putting this out, and that it is now beginning to come. It's now the latest school textbooks of NCERT have reinserted it back. But it just tells you how the history of the armed resistance to the British was wiped out of our memory. You can see, but if you go and look at newspapers of that time, you can see that was what was in the front pages of that time. So this was not a small event that I happened to have dragged out from somewhere. This was the single biggest event that scared the British colonial government at that time. So with this, as I said, the British realized that they could no longer hold India. And on the 15th of August, 1947, India received its independence. But it also turned out to be one of the saddest days in Indian history because it was also simultaneously partitioned. It is not by chance that the two provinces that had contributed the most to the revolutionary movement were also the provinces that were partitioned, Bengal and Punjab. The third group of people who had been a major contributory to this were Maharashtrians, particularly Maharashtrian Brahmin community. They also faced a lot of persecution, as it happened that a member of that community was involved a year later in the assassination of Gandhiji. And subsequent to that, there were massive riots across India, but specifically in Maharashtra against the Brahmin community. Thousands of them, maybe something like between 5,000 and 8,000 of them were actually killed and burnt in riots. All their properties were burned down. Not very dissimilar to what happened to the Sikhs in 1984. Again, something many of you may not be even aware of. Savarkar's younger brother, who was a great revolutionary in his own right, was actually stoned to death on the streets of Mumbai. What happened to Gandhiji was wrong, but at least Godse was captured and he was hanged and punished for what he did. It should be remembered that no one was ever prosecuted for Narayan Savarkar's death. In fact, there was no investigation at all. Now, many of these things I have tried to bring back this history back. This was the background of my book called The Revolutionaries, which some of you have read here, which tells this rough story. I have also translated into English for the first time Sachindranath Sanyal's own book called Bandi Jeevan, A Life in Chains, which is about the Gatherite phase of his revolution. He never wrote about the later phase because I think he didn't get the chance to do it. In any case, as you know, that was a live revolution. He was not a writer, he was a live participant. So he probably didn't want to write about what was happening live. But his book, which had been a major, it was almost a Bible for the revolutionaries, called Bandi Jeevan. It is now available in English as well, and I translated it and published it a few years ago. What I would now like to do is to tell you a little bit about something else we are doing to popularize this history. I have recently been involved with Amazon Prime to convert my book into an Amazon Prime series about the story of the revolutionaries. It's called, the book, the OTT series is called Revolutionaries. It will be coming out next month in September. It's a 3-season series. So the first season with 8 parts will be coming out. It doesn't tell the entire story because it would have become unwieldy. So it really starts with the second generation, with the Raj Bihari Bose generation, with the Gatharites. And the first season talks about the Gatherite phase of this movement. But I hope what I have been able to do through the course of this is to tell you that this was not a sort of individual heroes who did something randomly here and there. To the extent the story is told at all, it's told in terms of biographies. But you see, it misses the point completely. So, for example, many of you here will be aware of Sri Aurobindo's life. But you see, if you only know it as Sri Aurobindo's life, then you will not understand that this is a part of a chain. There is a wider movement, that his own involvement in what he did not end with him coming to Pondicherry. What he had kind of triggered carried on through many generations of revolutionaries and ultimately had a direct impact on India becoming a free nation. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have.
And what if the akharas are still alive? And which akhara do people represent?
Okay, so the akhara culture is still alive, although not quite in the way it used to be. It is now much more diluted, but there are few places where the traditional akharas have been revived. For example, in Kerala, the Kaladi tradition. I believe the Slambang tradition has suddenly recent times also been revived. There is interest in these akharas in other parts of the country as well. In Haryana, for example, they've now become more oriented towards sports wrestling, but still they exist there. But the traditional akharas are in bad condition in many places, including in Bengal. And I have taken it upon myself to try and revive this tradition in some way. Incidentally, our traditional akharas of the Sanyal clan were, of course, taken away from us in 1926 following the Kakodi rebellion. But I have, on my own little way, tried to bring it back by encouraging others to build it back. In fact, I have an akhada in my own house. And I myself train using the gada and mudgars and other lathi and other traditional things. My elder son, as it happens to be, has taken up this tradition as a professional MMA fighter. So it is not entirely dead. But yes, the movement itself, the akhada culture itself, is not in quite the same way as it exists. Some places it has got secularized into basically becoming sports clubs or gyms, which is somewhat different from the idea of martial arts akhada. In the past, akhadas would be of 2 types. One of them were the sampradaya akhadas. For example, the akhadas belonging to various orders of monks, like, for example, the Nath akhadas had. So, for example, the term Gorkha actually relates to those who follow Gorakhnath. Yogi Adityanath is the head of that. and they were a warrior monk culture. And so when you hear the word Gorkha today, yes, it's related to a warrior culture, but we think of them as Nepalese. But in fact, it has nothing to do with a region. It has to do with whether or not you follow this tradition of Gorakhnath and the martial tradition of Gorakhnath. So they were the Gorkhas. Similarly, if you go to the Kumbh Mela, you will still see some of the old akhada, sampradaya akhadas come there for the snan, and you will see they still march in with swords and so on. So there is some memory of it, but it is not seen as a live system of martial training. Similarly, the non-sampradaya akhadas, which were run by either the temples or the grihas. So almost every Shakti temple, every Shakti Peeth would have an akhada attached to it. And you would see a lot of training would happen. And remember, this is not physical training for fitness as such. This is martial arts for warfare. And much of modern yoga is actually derived from this tradition. The akhadas of the Sanyals in Varanasi, for example, Kriya Yoga today through Shamacharan Lahiri is derived from that tradition. In Bengal also, a lot of modern yoga came out of this akhada tradition. The akhadas themselves, as I said, the odd one has survived and even flourished. In Maharashtra, you have the talims. The talim of Kolhapur has done well. But yes, as a general principle, it has not done so well. There was a time when every young man, and also in some areas women, but mostly men, would effectively be a part of an akhada, the neighborhood akhada. And they would basically train there, and that would be an important part of their education. You basically became a man in your akhada. That tradition, as I said, is now diluted very significantly. A modern gym is not quite an akhada, right? However, as I said, there are sort of mutated versions of it that have survived. For example, the Anushilan Samiti's Nagpur branch eventually became the RSS. And the RSS's network of shakhas is effectively the akhada network as well. It is directly derived from the Anushilan Samiti and the Bhavani Mandir network idea of so the RSS is one manifestation of that. Another manifestation is, of course, your own teaching in your school, where you have a very big emphasis on physical education run by Pranabda, who incidentally was my granduncle. One branch of my family, the Bhattacharya branch of the family, great granduncle to be correct, and Bhattacharya branch of the family did move here, and so not everybody in my family continued in the revolutionary path. Some of them moved away along with Sri Aurobindo, came here, and his family were here for quite some time. Some of you may remember he passed away only about 20-30 years ago. And when, for example, Aurobindo was set up, the idea was actually to have an akhada there. And if you read the mother's writings on how Aurobindo was to be run, she writes over there that it was supposed to be basically run through a network of gymnasts. She used the words gymnast, but actually, who are gymnasts? They are actually what she really means is they are the members of the trained members of the akhada. So the akhada tradition is, oddly enough, alive, and you are in some ways witness to it in a somewhat different way, but it still exists here, right here. So yes, it does exist.
Yes, sir. There is one here. About 12 kilometers from here, there is a Gurukula.
Yeah, so that is a traditional
akhada. The traditional one with Karlakatta.
Yes.
But I want to remind you that when you think of a real living akhada, the idea is not merely to keep alive the old traditions. When the akhadas were at their height, they were real places for martial training. And so, if you want to have true akhadas, that military training of a modern kind should also be imparted. They need to be, for example, maybe today they should be trained how to run military drones and so on. So they were not a place for tradition. They were a tradition for keeping alive the military spirit of Hindu society. And so every Hindu temple, particularly the Shakti temples, all had an attached akhada. Very often, if you go to a temple, you will see there is a kind of an empty space which has not been paved over. And unfortunately, one thing we do is somehow somebody thinks it was originally a cow shed and they put 2 cows there. No, that was the akhada. That was the mud pit where the wrestlers were trained. And so, unfortunately, all the temples I go, the old akhadas have now been sort of no longer akhadas. And they had very strong traditions. So if you want a true akhada, there will always be a presiding deity, usually some form of Shakti. Bhavani is a very popular one, Durga, Kali. But there are also Vaishnava akhadas where Hanumanji is Bajrang in his form as Bajrang Bali is worshipped. There are also Shaivite akhadas where Shiva in his fierce form as Bhairav is worshipped. So the akhada tradition still exists, but not in the form, not quite in its, I would say, its heyday anymore.
I have one question. You highlighted the akhada system, and during the Mahakumbh, there were hundreds of akhadas, Niranjana akhada, Juna akhada. But there was one akhada which was accentuated in this time. And when I went to this particular akhada, they would tell that we did a lot for the Indian freedom. And that was particularly the Kinnar akhada.
Well, the Kinnar akhada is a new akhada. I don't know what their origins are. I mean, new akhadas can be built, but it's not clear that they have an old origin. I mean, you can add new akhadas, no problem. Maybe they have, but they need to document it. I am not aware of the documentation. But the other akhadas did have a tradition. The akhadas like the Juna akhada, for example, while they didn't play a great role in the revolutionary movement, they had indeed played a role against the Islamic invasions. There is documented them fighting off an attack on, I think, either Mathura or Gokul or one of Vrindavan. One of these were attacked by, and they had fought. By the way, they sometimes fought each other as well, so it's not always outward oriented. There were internal battles and so on. So many of these akhadas do have very old tradition. The Gorakh tradition, for example, has going back to the 8th, 9th century, fighting the Turkic invasions of that time. So, and in fact, Gorakh tradition extends even into Afghanistan. They have, you have, for example, Rawalpindi, named after the Rajasthani lineage of the Nath tradition, Bappa Rawal.
Any light on the Southern revolutionaries?
So, yes, there were Southern revolutionaries. I have mentioned one of them here. The bulk of the movement came from Punjab and Bengal and to some extent Maharashtra. But it is the case that there were Southern revolutionaries. One of them, of course, I mentioned here was VVS Iyer, who was in fact living in India House when all those events I talked about happened. In fact, he was the person, incidentally, who caught that mole in India House and exposed him. And then he was also the person who then would take great joy in writing all those false reports that were being sent up to the British intelligence. There were others as well. For example, there was Sitaram Raju. So there were several others in southern India. Also to be remembered that not all the acts by southern Indians happened in India. So for example, a significant part of the INA were actually Tamils who were working in Malaya, who joined the British Indian Army. You also had several sailors of the Royal Indian Navy who were part of the rebellion in the naval revolt. In fact, my book talk about Odakkal Muhammad, who was one of the rebels of the Navy during the naval revolt. And his son, by the way, was also Odakkal Johnson would later help me actually research this book. So there were many, yes. And they are mentioned in my book.
Yeah, one quick question. You spoke about this rioting which happened after Gandhi was assassinated. We understood that Godse was captured and he was hanged. we didn't know about this rioting. What
There
are
was
the forces-
massive riots.
What are the forces behind this riot?
So, many of Gandhi's supporters then went on a rampage, in a most un-Gandhian rampage across India against specifically Maharashtrian Brahmins. Now, there is a backstory to this hatred towards Maharashtrian Brahmins, in that the British had heavily invested into hatred towards this class because they were always afraid that this group would somehow reinstigate the Maratha Empire. Remember, the British actually did not conquer India from the Mughals, unlike the impression you get again from your textbooks. The British had conquered India from the Marathas, who had essentially controlled most of India for 80 years after the Mughals. And so the real danger that the British saw was some attempt to revive the Maratha Empire. And the Maratha empires were a big empire. It went all the way to Attock in the north, and in the south they were in Tanjavur. So, it was not a trivial empire, and they ruled from Gujarat on one end to Odisha on the other. So this was a large empire, and it is they who provided the biggest resistance to the conquest of India by the British. 1857-58, that was also very much, a lot of it was about the Maratha empire revolting. Nana Sahib, Lani Lakshmibai, these are all Maratha rebels. So they were very afraid that this particular group of people would resurrect the Maratha Empire. And so they invested very heavily in anti-Brahmanism, in Maharashtra in particular. This was then, in a sense, weaponized by the British to creating a sort of anti-Brahmin feeling that already existed. But of course, with the assassination of Gandhi, large packs of Congress workers, who ironically call themselves Gandhians, basically descended on this community and carried out large-scale massacres. Many of the people who faced this massacre are still alive, and they will tell you about how their homes were burnt, how their relatives were killed, and so on and so forth. This was at least at the same scale as what happened to the Sikhs after the assassination of Indira Gandhi. But again, as I said, at least in the case of the Sikhs, you hear a lot about it. The story of the massacres of Maharashtrian Brahmins is almost never told. And in fact, it's only with my book, Revolutionaries, that I began to talk about it, and there's some revival of conversation about this. Yes, ma'am.
My question might be a bit indirect, not related to the revolutionaries, but at some point during this revolution and the freedom movement, there was this Cripps proposal. Is there any connection?
Yes, I actually talked about it in the...
At what stage does it propose?
But this Cripps proposal basically happened, what year was it, if you remind me? 1942. Do remember that this is happening in the middle of the war. And the revolutionaries themselves, although Shri Aurobindo wrote about this, etc., and I do write about this in my book, but the revolutionaries of the extant revolutionaries of the time were not really involved in it. Netaji, as you know, in 1942 was in Germany. Shri Sanyal was in jail, or he was dead, depending on the dates, and so on and so forth. The revolutionaries really were much more focused on fighting the British more directly during the Second World War.
I just have one, not a question, but just wanted to know your perception. Like, there is a very minor difference between the true revolutionaries and the pseudo-revolutionaries.
And what, sorry?
Like, for example, the cause of the revolution can be for a bad thing as well, right? I mean, people, like for example, we were using the presentation that we heard about that that was for a great humanity for freedom. The same concept in a very falsehood, like everything is huge scale, right? And the same concept in a different thing, bad things are also coming out. So what is your perception?
So what you are basically asking is that, were the revolutionaries terrorists? And the answer is absolutely not. Because, and I'll explain this, you see, this is great amount of wrangling that Indians have, because we have been told that, the freedom struggle was all very peaceful. So when I point out to them the armed struggle was just as important, they begin to get into all this conversation. But if you go to Europe and went to France and ask them about the resistance to the Nazis, you will not have this conversation at all. They are very clear in their head, the revolutionaries of their resistance to the Nazis were good guys. Nobody is going to say that the French resistance were terrorists. Have you ever heard this? So one part of it is unlocking this in your head. So the question is, what is the difference? Well, there's a massive difference. In fact, the revolutionaries themselves write about this. In their writing, Sachindranath Sanyal is one of them. They write about this. First of all, they point out that, look, we carry out our attacks against clearly people who are acting to suppress us. Notice here that during this entire period, there were tens of thousands of British women, British children living in India. None of these episodes do you see them being directly attacked. There were one or two occasions where women did get killed, but they were bystanders or something like that. They were never the focus of attack. What they were doing was they were attacking the viceroy. They were attacking the causing a revolt in the army or navy. So you can see, first of all, that their objective, so their means, is by attacking people, the occupation force of the British in India. And as I said, this hand-wringing that you're talking about does not happen in any society. Nowhere in Vietnam will they talk about their resistance to first the French and later to the Americans and call them, oh my God, no, the Viet Cong were terrorists. This has been put in our heads essentially to question our own freedom movement. So this is the first point. The second point is, one important difference, which again the revolutionaries themselves emphasized, was that they were not anarchists. Because at that time the word terrorist was not widely used. The word used at those days was anarchists. And anarchists were basically against any form of the state, some random attacks. The revolutionaries were not doing random attacks. They in fact went out of their way. When, for example, the Hindustan Republican Association was formed, they took the trouble of actually writing a constitution by which they stated how India would be ruled when it became free. Now, this is actually quite a revolutionary act in its own right. So in 1923, Sachindranath Sanyal actually wrote a pamphlet, which was the Constitution of the Hindustan Republican Association, in which it first of all asked for a completely independent India. Now, notice that at this point, the Indian National Congress was only asking for dominion status. So it is the revolutionaries who asked for freedom, not the Congress or even Gandhi. Much later, they asked for freedom. Secondly, no one, including the Congress or anyone, had clearly enunciated what would happen, who would run India when India would become free. It was the revolutionaries who wrote out what the state would do and how it would form after becoming independent. So in that pamphlet of the Hindustan Republican Association's constitution, it writes that India will be not only independent, it will be democratic republic with universal franchise. Okay, this is a time in which in large parts of the world, women did not have the vote. And even in the UK, by the way, at that time, women did not have the vote. And in many cases that were democratic, even men, large proportion of the male population also did not have the vote. So it was very limited franchise. The revolutionaries were the first to talk about a democratic republic with universal franchise. So they were not anarchists. They were clear that you needed a state, and they were clear about what that state would be like. We in fact have records of the debates internally within the revolutionary groups about what this would be. So for example, people like Sachindranath Sanyal wanted republic, democratic. There were others who wanted a constitutional monarchy as well. So there was actually a debate about potentially India being a constitutional monarchy, with interestingly Sayaji Gaikwad as the constitutional monarch. So that was also a line of discussion. And of course, Sayaji Gaikwad had been the person who had funded, of course, Ambedkar, but before that he had also funded Aurobindo Ghosh. So, there were a lot of debates. So this was not a random group of anarchists just trying to carry out random acts of violence. They were thoughtful young men who thought, and in some cases also young women, who thought about how India would be ruled. Their acts of revolution were very directed, and in certain stages they were recognized by other parts of the world. As I told you, they had international linkages. The provisional government of Azad Hind, which Netaji headed, was a fully recognized government of the Axis powers. All the Axis power governments recognized him as a government, including, interestingly, Ireland, which was not an Axis power, but Ireland also recognized Netaji's government. So it was a recognized government. So these were not anarchists at all.